Hi, welcome to the October 12th meeting of the CNCF IoT Edge Working Group. On the agenda today, we've got a discussion of the Edge Native white paper that we've been working on for a few months now in preparation for a talk to be delivered at KubeCon North America. There's probably room for additional items if somebody wants to add something to the agenda notes or just verbally speak up right now. To drive that white paper discussion, unless somebody's got another item to nominate, I'll pick Kate to do that because I think she's the one most invested in this, giving the talk in a couple of weeks.
Sure, yeah, happy to kick us off. I think it would be nice to build scope on this meeting, maybe what we want to try and achieve by the end of it. For one, I think we could try to, we've been doing this of late, go through and resolve comments, get things in a good place to start. And then I think there's also a big chunk that still, the main thing that is not ready is our last principle of external device connectivity. So we could also start with that, make sure that's in text form. And then from there, kind of see if we can bring things together. Another thing that I was thinking is the list of open source projects, deciding if that feels complete and deciding how to handle that. And then the final thing would be references, the things that are on my mind. The final thing is making sure our references are complete and also footnoted throughout the paper. We could assign someone to that after. And the people who listed themselves as writers or reviewers, making sure that they are involved in the way that they would like to be. So those are some things that I was thinking we could address. Are there other things that people think might be good to do during this session?
Hey, Kate, I was gonna ask if, for everyone's thoughts, if we want to put this in GitHub, transitioning from Google into Markdown, I would assume.
Yeah,
And
so
then
I think
at what point, and then where would that go?
yeah, so I think that is a goal of ours, and ideally to do that before KubeCon if we feel like we're ready for an official draft to be published. That would go, so the CNCF IoT Edge working group is under the runtime tag, so it would go under runtime, and I was just gonna PR, or one of us can PR into runtime and say create a new folder or directory called white papers and link from our landing page there. I'll share a link to that. But yeah, ideally we can do that, whether that's this working group meeting after this one, or thanks Dan, or the next. That would be kind of the place that I would see it going. And then I think we've talked about, I think Brandon's mentioned this, after our draft, when we feel like we're in a good state, are there other places that we want to put this, and kind of expanding that conversation. Anything else that people think we should look into? Okay, if people aren't opposed, I'm
I
gonna
couldn't find the unmute quickly
Oh.
because it was buried, but
Go for it.
one other thing we talked about before is maybe having a practice dry run of the presentation. If you think you could do that by the next meeting, or we could have just an informal supplemental get together.
Yeah, I think we definitely can do a practice run next meeting. I think I wasn't quite sure at what level we want to, do we want to do a full practice run, or was it also just to look at the slides again?
Yeah, I think we looked at the slides, at least a rough draft with the agenda last time, and looked good. I'd suggest maybe we've got a lot of things already on that list that maybe aren't going to come together until just before the next meeting. So if you're not ready, I'd say postpone it. And, you kind of have to get some of those things ready to have a because they'll feed into your deck, I suspect. So
Okay.
do it only if you're ready, and if you're not, my experience is sometimes you don't get that practice run, until you're even physically at the conference in the speaker lounge or something. And if it happens, it happens. But since you have two speakers, I believe you kind of are going to have to do one to have it come off okay. Just personal opinion, but
Yeah. So Amar just hopped on. The question from Steve was whether to have a practice run in our next meeting, and I'm comfortable with that. We're meeting after this to kind of look through our slides even more. So I'd be fine with that. My only caveat would be is that if there's another topic for the working group, we can make it a one-off with a smaller group. I think sometimes it's hard to get feedback from large groups. But yeah, let's tentatively plan on that for the next meeting, unless Amar, you have any other thoughts on that?
As I skipped the last meeting, if the slides are public, can they be shared?
Yeah, I think that's the other issue is I'm not sure you're supposed to have like a
Yeah.
full dry run of a KubeCon talk, like on a recorded. Like, I think KubeCon wants to be the recorded presentation. And so that's my other concern with doing a true dry run in a recorded meeting. So yeah, that is a fair thought.
yeah, we could always just pause the recording too, so that it's not there. I'm expecting, if you literally, it's the first time you've ever done it, it'll be so rough that you probably don't want it in circulation. The whole point of it is to, get down your timing, your content and everything. And very few people get it right the first time. Okay, well, anyway, that was me. I've been keeping notes in this of what the agenda is for this. So the first
Okay.
item was resolve the scope, I think, if you wanted to move on.
Yeah, I guess that was resolve the scope for today. So I think our scope is maybe to try and get through as many of these as we can. And we did resolve scope on let's present next time, and let's do that after the end of the meeting and stop the record for that. With that, how do people feel about moving to external device connectivity, looking at that? Okay.
Fine with me.
Okay, so Dan, do you mind kicking us off with the summary of your thoughts here? And if folks want, or maybe folks want to take like a 30 seconds to read through kind of the bullet point here.
I just want to say that this bullet point is just my outline and the draft of the thoughts I had on the topic. So I wanted to go with the group to review them before continuing in shaping it, but that's on the agenda today, so that's good.
Okay. And I think part of this is we originally thought we were going to have a paragraph for each of these, and now it's just kind of larger clumps. So inside the chart, and so we just need to condense all of this into 3 sentences probably.
Yeah.
So
So I think the CNC projects in the space are all already covered later on, right? So we can already remove it.
yeah, I agree with that. So if you were to kind of give a kind of elevator pitch on what this is about, we're trying to both mention the issue at hand of there's a lot of sensors, and then recognize that you need to deal with it in a certain way. Is that kind of
Yeah, I think the 3 sentences explanation would be the difference between the cloud native workload and edge native workload is that edge native workload needs to communicate with the local hardware resources, right? So, which is not the case, or rarely the case in the cloud space. So then examples are all these things like USB cameras or local radio sense devices, or all of that require us to have a special consideration for workloads running on the edge, so that they can, for example, run in a privileged mode or with raised access levels to be able to access those resources and be able and expose those resources to the workloads. So containers or WASI or whatever we use.
Okay, and so my follow-up question is how are we distinguishing between external device connectivity and resource aware? Since we have both. And one thing Amar noted is that we have some groupings going on. So we have resource aware, external device connectivity, and aware of variable availability as being a part of this larger idea of resource and device awareness / monitoring. So maybe for starters, can I move this resource aware grid to be next to device connectivity so we can reconcile those next to each other?
Absolutely.
Oops. Okay. Does anyone know what this note about seeing the differences table above for app model elasticity, resilience, and data model discussions? The point of connecting that with resource aware was, I don't remember when we generated that line.
I think maybe I put it there. My point was just to make sure we're consistent.
Consistent from what we say. Oh, because we have
I think the differences table, we have that row on data models, et cetera, et cetera. So my point was, we shouldn't say anything different. We should just be consistent. I'm actually driving, so I can't read it, but that's what I recall. Yeah, I think I put that in.
okay, so that's more of a note. It's not meant to be actual content of the definition.
No,
it's
no,
just...
no.
Okay, I'm gonna take this out and make it a note then. I think that's a good, Steve, maybe you can add that to the to-dos of like having editors ensure that we're consistent across our differences and similarities tables and our principles tables.
Okay, I'll add it to the notes. I just dropped a comment on the external device connectivity in the chat too.
So, okay, so I'm gonna just put it in here, Steve, because I think it's easier if we're all looking at it. So kind of the summary that Steve put in the chat is external device connectivity is in one sentence all about the challenges related to edge device connectivity. So it's getting an inventory or device monitoring, health of device checks or health checks of devices and connections to devices, update management.
I mean, the more I look at it, the more I think that resource aware and the external device connectivity, I think could be merged, right?
I'm trying to find back at our notes, because there's a reason we separated them and I can't remember
Yeah.
what it was.
I was in the beginning under impression that resource aware is more related to the actual host, the resources on the host, so CPUs, memories, storage, and things like that. And the connectivity is then the thing about communicating with the, let's say, leaf devices and things like that.
Yeah, I think it is. I think in general, I can't see how, if it's this is specifically external devices, and if they're external, they shouldn't be really using the host node's memory or CPU. If the connection to the device is IP based with some of your orchestrators and container runtimes, you have a semblance of establishing limits to what they might be able to use. But if these devices are not using, traditional IP-based connectivity, I don't think the typical container runtime or orchestrator or OS will do anything for you. So there isn't necessarily a mechanism with existing technology to monitor or impose limits on resource consumption related to communications. The best we could do is indicate it's there. I don't think we could, I don't, falls into the either unsolved problem space or out of scope. So whether we raise resource management there, I think we could safely leave it out, because in terms of best practices today, I'm not sure there is any kind of recommendation we could do other than observe that maybe this is an unsolved problem. Anybody think I'm wrong there?
You're saying the unsolved problem is rate limiting the number of connections to these external devices.
Yeah, well, it isn't necessarily even the number of connections, but one connection hogging it all if they're on a shared bus, like a 4K camera at 60 frames a second. If it goes wild, maybe maybe if these are smart cameras that do motion detect and only send on motion, you don't want one going wild so that the other ones don't get a shot. Whether this is something there's existing technology on, I don't know. If there is, I'm not aware of it, but
yeah, I mean, if you're talking about output from the devices, I think that's
Yeah.
one thing. If you're talking about input, then I guess if you put a load balancer in front, or like have basically you can't establish a direct connection with the device. But yeah, I think that's fair. And it's sounding like you're bringing the discussion up from the category of resource aware. Like the principle of resource aware made you bring up this topic. And the reason I was saying that is because I see that topic as being about external device connectivity, which furthers the point of maybe these should be merged. Is anyone opposed to merging resource aware and external device connectivity?
I don't know. It's a little confusing because there is an issue of resource management with the compute on the applications running at these edge nodes. So the moment we inject this into external devices, you're going to have to add some material on, what the difference is here.
Well, I think one of them is, I think resource usage optimization encompasses some of that. And I think the word external can be removed. So we could say resource aware, and that's external and internal, but I think our discussion may have been, we wanted something explicitly discussing external devices.
Okay, well, as long as somebody else volunteers, we've said that in this table, we need to be able to convert it to text. If somebody has a succinct way to convert resource management in the context of devices to text, I have no objection to it. It's just that I wouldn't want to write that myself.
I don't see a need to address management of devices.
Yeah.
In either of these, I don't see a need to put the word management. So I think what we could do is, I think resource aware, the reason I think I'm remembering the reason we put it is because in the similarities and differences slide, we mentioned how the edge is more heterogeneous. So applications need to be more aware of what resources are on their compute. So they need to know if a GPU is there, they need to know what kind of hardware it has, more so than a regular like data center cloud app. While that's a different discussion than external device connectivity, right? I see those are two different things.
Yeah, up to now, I wasn't thinking of a GPU as being in the category of an external device, but now that you mention it, I suppose some people could think that, but to me, that's belongs more under the category of compute, even though it is a device. I mean, the CPU is a device too, and so are the memory chips, but
Yeah,
I
I definitely
think-
wouldn't call it external device. I agree with you on
but
that.
to me, these devices we're talking about here are IO devices.
Exactly. I agree with that as well. I think GPUs are a compute mechanism and not a data source.
So maybe we should, you remove the word external, but maybe is it appropriate to call these IO devices to narrow it down to prevent confusion with things like GPUs?
I don't think the word external is confusing. Like I think I phrased what I was saying wrong. I don't think a GPU is an external device.
Okay.
And I maybe if someone else thinks that, then yeah, we should say IO devices, but I'm aligned with that. I don't think a GPU is an external device, but I think what Amar was saying about maybe we talk about compute resources, or I guess we should scope. What are we trying to figure out right now? Are we trying to distinguish between resource aware and external device connectivity, or are we trying to focus on external device connectivity?
I would do the first, just see if there's a need for external device connectivity, or is it all just a resource aware, right?
If we keep both, what is the line we're drawing? This is,
I hate to throw this in a different direction, but I'll do it anyway, that maybe this isn't external device connectivity so much as management, which is broader than connectivity. You know, management would entail, to me, taking inventory of the devices, discovering them, maybe trying to keep their firmware updated. And that goes beyond connectivity.
So what I originally thought here is just how, so for me, management is an application already. So that's why we won't be covering it here. So it depends on a lot of factors, and it's completely beyond the applications, right? But
well, you could choose to do it in an application, but it's possible that maybe someday some orchestrator or something, you know, in the stack would take it on too. So I'm not sure. An application is a way to address the challenge one way, but the principle is still there. And this is something that is a little different from a public cloud data center environment. You know, if you're hosted in AWS, you don't worry about managing devices. The cloud provider isn't going to let you get to any devices sitting there anyway, even if you wanted to. But at Edge, this is one of the fundamental distinctions, that you've got these IO devices, and we need to call them out in some row of this table, I think. And what the title of that cell is on the left side, I think, you know, external device something, and maybe it's management.
I actually like connectivity because it's very clear to the reader what we are talking about and what the delineation between cloud and edge is. Maybe in the text we could put in management, but the word connectivity, I mean, it appeals to me.
Okay, I'd be willing to go along with that, especially if the alternative is not to even have the row. But I think having the, disappearing the row doesn't seem to be appropriate to me. Anybody else have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I don't think we should get rid of the row.
Okay.
I also like
No,
connectivity.
no.
I just wanted to reword resource aware and external device connectivity to get it straight.
Okay,
The-
Be-
Okay, they're resource aware. The way you just reworded that when you said heterogeneous and the application is tied more, it's not as abstracted, for lack of a better term. It's more tightly coupled to the hardware, if you will. Or the heterogeneous really resonated when you were describing that. And I think you have that now.
yeah, I
You
essentially
just stated it. Yeah, go ahead.
I essentially just pasted this from our differences. We have a hardware awareness differences. And so I repeated the wording. So I said, rather than having homogeneous hardware platforms, developers need to be aware of a wider variety of hardware and interfaces. And that's what we're defining as resource aware, because that removes the word connections, because that's what was really throwing me off. And local resources is a little vague. So what are people's thoughts on that?
I like it because I was also thrown off, especially not being there for the last meeting, that supporting connections to local resources is something that threw me off, that it might be the same thing we want to talk about in the external device connectivity. So I think right now it's much more clear.
Okay. Should I get rid of this? Are people okay with changing it to reflect similarly to what we said in hardware awareness? Slash, should we rename this from resource aware to hardware awareness?
I don't know, I could go either way on this, so somebody else decide.
I think I like hardware awareness more. I think, again, it's from a reader point of view, it's more obvious what we are talking about.
How about I leave these as edits and we continue on to external device connectivity, and maybe people will have thoughts about it afterwards or after the meeting.
Sounds good.
Okay, so for external device connectivity, this is all about, now we're talking about that heterogeneous environment outside of the node, and how applications need to find a way, need to consider all of the connection endpoints around them in their environment. And what is that process like, and what does that entail?
And I think we can talk there about as Tomoya suggested, it's a dynamic and changing environment, and we need tools to discover and use those devices.
I honestly think this is a really good wording from Tamoya. I'm just gonna put it in here as we're chatting, but
Yeah.
the hardware device gets us a little confusing, but so I'm just gonna for now to keep us in line.
I like the wording. I would just say that it needs to be aware not just of the changes, but of the devices and the changes, right? And the runtime changes of the existing devices and the changes.
Okay, so you're saying we need to first off by saying that they need to be aware, they need to know how to connect to the devices in their environment.
Yeah. And be aware of the changes. Yeah.
Tamoya, what since you came up with this great comment, do you feel like this is a way we could word the whole principle itself?
Yeah, that looks good to me.
Are we, so I think the last sentence of it is kind of a reword of the first couple sentences, but it's also very good. Is there a way we can incorporate that? So the word capability, for example, is an interesting concept, but I think we'd want to define it before using it. But I like that. Maybe we can say the capabilities of applications on the edge. No, maybe that's getting too much. But it seems like what you're saying here is a capability of a server on the edge is also that of all of the resources around it. It's not static. Those resources aren't static, and therefore the capabilities of a server isn't static. But I wonder if that's a bit too much for discussion in this grid.
Maybe just saying connectivity capability is not static. I don't know if that's clear enough.
I mean, that includes the environment.
Or maybe just use environment instead of capability.
Yeah. Or if that's complicated, maybe we can remove.
do we have a fleet as a term somewhere else, or what would be that referred to? Control the application, or?
Yeah, that
Maybe
looks
some-
good to me.
Because we
Yeah.
can talk about like an application state could be running, not running, updated.
That sounds good.
So is there anything in the bullets that we're not including here? We don't get into details about the types, so like,
Yeah, or the considerations, and I don't think they belong here in that in that 2-3 sentences description. So you can describe it later in a paragraph if needed, or in a specialized section, right?
do we want an intro sentence along the lines of something like this of on the edge applications are closer to the source of compute. They must know how to connect to those devices.
And I tried to do that in the first 2 points. So saying that the actual source of that data is coming to those external devices.
Do we cover that at the very beginning of the paper? Under what is edge? In other words, do we need to restate it here?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Joel. We do cover that. So I think you're right. We can just, at this point, if you got into the last principle, you understand that that's a.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. And I think this grid of the paper is something that is going to be one for a lot of offshoot papers if we are able to get to that point, because there is a lot here to talk about. Okay, so if people are okay with this, then I will, should I go ahead and
Just
clean
remove
this
it.
up?
Yeah.
I really like that docs lets us track state. So if we want to reference these notes, we can look at an older revision. Okay, and so now that we've talked about external device connectivity, how do we feel about the hardware aware update?
The only thing that concerns me a little bit is that we talked a little bit about it in the portability, right? Saying different hardware platform and local resources and
yeah, I think the only issue here is an IO device a locally attached hardware. I think that's where we get grainy with external device. I think what that boundary is the problem. But if there's a slight blending of these I think that's okay. And we can even have a footnote that discusses that boundary. So maybe we add a footnote that says like the boundary between hardware and external device is vague. But regardless of that boundary, you need to be aware of that. Regardless of that, external device connectivity is trying to discuss how that can change. So if you define hardware as something that can be plugged in, removed, then take into account like external device connectivity principle. Otherwise, just take into account that your hardware is more varied in general. I mean, that's a way big footnote, but we could have a footnote along those lines.
I think that sounds good. I mean, it's not going to be completely tidy. You'll have some overlap.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna resolve these unless folks feel otherwise.
Go for it.
Yeah, sounds good.
So, okay, at this point, we have 15 minutes left. What do we want to do next on our agenda, on the list of things that we said we have to do? Do we want to, maybe next on our list was list of open source projects, is this complete? So I'll go to that next unless there's other ways we want to swerve next. What I did this past week is went through, CNCF has a bunch of projects. I downloaded the CSV and Control F Edge and tried to put everything on there that mentioned Edge. And then after looking at it, did seem to have an Edge use case. So that added Fab Edge, NATS, Intel Smart Open Edge. All of those came from that, along with OpenYurt, Super Edge, and K3S, which we've talked about in the past. Also Metal LB came from that because it's focused on like kind of bare metal edge scenarios. Also there's some from Eclipse that I added just from looking at, like, they have a list that I think I lost the link of, but I did link it at one point. But is there, the other section's a little concerning because obviously we didn't get them all. What are people's thoughts on this area in general?
I think it needs some work. It looks a little small. Mosquito is an Eclipse. It's under other, unless that's where you're putting the Eclipse things. But hey, I think have people who want to volunteer to embellish this, but I don't think this list appears ready to go to me.
When would it be ready? Like, what's the number that we feel like we would be comfortable with?
Well, I think maybe you just have to declare a date, and those who want to, I don't think there's deletions likely from this list, but there might be adds. And it would kind of be nice to not just list them, but go to the work of making the name of this thing be a link. You know, if I were a reader of this white paper, it would be a value add if these things were actual URL links to go find out more about these.
For sure. And I think that also made me think is, should this whole section link to a working CSV document? What if it's like a just literally a Excel doc or a Google Sheets doc that one column is principal, the other is link, and the other is name, and then you have description, kind of like what CNCF has. And this whole section, all it does is link to that.
I don't know, what's the value versus just having the link be in text? You know, if it's in text and you elect to have a slide that summarizes this, for example, you could just cut and paste it, but I think if it's a spreadsheet, that's a little messier.
I just meant for the value I see it as is we're not going to get them all. And so being able to say this is a working document is representative of the fact that it is a working list. And so pointing to a list and saying we got it started, I think like in the presentation, we would pull out several of them, maybe 2 from each principal, but having something like that.
Yeah, I'm indifferent on it being a spreadsheet just because it seems like another place to go to maintain.
And that was one of the discussions we had from the beginning of the group. I mean, if you start maintaining this kind of list, it's then either ongoing process or it will, you know, get stale.
The upside of, I guess, of it being a spreadsheet is if this is going to go in GitHub, doing pull requests to make an update to that is maybe a little more painful than it being an external reference of a spreadsheet that could just be edited.
I think it's fine to keep it instead of diverting us to a different thing. Let's focus on, okay, this is going to be in text. That seems fine. One thing when we were creating the slides, Amar changed this to be a grid. And I think that might be more helpful going along with our grid format of have this be a principles grid, just like we had earlier. And then each project, and then in parentheses, the foundation. So it could be CNCF, LF, networking, LF Edge, LF, Eclipse, and then just add it that way, maybe. And
you know, in the long run, if we wanted this to be a living thing, taking it as a model, the CNCF itself has their landscape thing right now, and it's driven by GitHub check-ins, mostly by people who want to appear in the landscape, just voluntarily submitting a PR. We could probably have a thing that we'd started. We are not going to get it done in the next 2 weeks, but in the long run, if we had an Edge native landscape that was kind of maintained by people who want to appear in there, meaning we don't have to do all of that work of keeping it up. It's up to the people kind of self-nominating to be relevant to the landscape. That would be something of value to the community. And I think that's where we should go as an end game. But for the short term of just getting a useful list that you can pop into your presentation, just saying, hey, here, maybe we, since this is a draft, we don't make a claim that this is exhaustive right now. It's just highlights or the ones we came across, and leave it at that. Because we're not going to be able to get a perfect list in 2 weeks.
Okay. That sounds good to me. What do you folks?
Kate,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Brandon. Before we move off the topic, I do think the landscape is something good to consider in the longer run. It's built on a free tool developed by the Linux Foundation, and I think they've got some processes whereby if we channel the request through the CNCF and make the case that we've got, you know, a critical mass and a interesting and useful angle on Edge native to create a landscape around, I think that they would be open to considering that, and I think that would have value as well. To give this initiative more visibility and elicit more participation. One of the things, having built out a landscape for LF networking, I know that we'll have to come up with categories, either on the X axis or Y axis or both, that talk about how the logical groupings of these projects should go. So we'd have to figure out those categories, whether they're aligned under our 8 or so principles or different parts of the edge from where they are on the edge. We would have to figure that out. But I do agree that's a good longer term goal. And then in the shorter term, I do think we want to have this be sort of an organic and open listing. If we go forward with something and say, hey, this is it, and it's not really subject to change, or we make change difficult, that might rankle some feathers from folks in the community that are using different projects that think that those projects merit inclusion on the list. We don't want to create the friction with those folks. So in order to reduce that, if we have it in a spreadsheet of some form and say, this is our first pass at creating the list, and these were our criteria, and it seems like we are sort of applying criteria around the principles to these projects rather than trying to get every single edge related project known to humankind on the list. But if we just have a statement of, hey, this is our first attempt based on this rough criteria, here's a list that is accessible. If you would like to add your edge project to the list, here's what you do, and sort of allow people to do that. That way people that care and feel that they're missing can get it added. Otherwise, other folks will just kind of nod and say, hey, the list looks good. I don't know what y'all think about that.
I agree with that. I like that plan and explanation.
So would making sure that people have a way to add their project, is that okay if we say PR into this draft to add your project, or are we saying that we need it to be a spreadsheet because that's lower friction?
Well, maybe we should even announce that we're thinking of going the direction of the landscape, but we're not ready to do it yet. I'd almost see this spreadsheet. If the landscape was there, that should be the one source of truth, not the spreadsheet. So maybe the spreadsheet should even be viewed as a draft, but people can get themselves on the interest list or whatever. I'll tell you another thing for purposes of this group, maybe suggest that the spreadsheet would also serve as a list of people in a queue that we'd ask to speak at meetings of our group. I mean, at some time, to keep this group interesting to actual community, we can't just endlessly have it be white paper draft discussions. I think our best attendance comes when we get speakers on interesting projects. So having a self-nominated spreadsheet to, indicate to the world that you've got something related to Edge would be useful to announce at KubeCon. And if you announce that people can put them in there, one thing would be, do we want it wide open, or is it restricted to open source only?
I think that's a great idea, Stephen. And if someone wants to nominate their project, their open source project, I do think we should err on open source to be added to our list and eventually our landscape. Here's the process for doing that. Sign up here. And then we also invite you to come to the IoT and Edge working group to talk about your project and how it integrates with the Edge native ecosystem. It's great to link those two together, so you make sure that the person proposing in the addition is wanting to get more engaged, and also, as you mentioned, fills up the pipeline of agendas for these meetings well into the future with some interesting topics. It sounds like a win-win.
I wonder, is the process just that anyone can access a spreadsheet? Anyone can add anything to it, or how do we handle access rights? And in that way, I think that's why GitHub's kind of nice, because you can submit a PR and someone can go in and look at the project and be like, oh, this is related to the Edge, or oh, this is cool, also come speak at our working group if you're available. For example, that's how the CNCF landscape works, is you have to submit a PR essentially into a GitHub spreadsheet. Yeah.
But maybe we can do it similar like we are doing with the white paper. So first period, be a sheet that any group member of the working group can at least suggest changes, and then when it shapes a little bit, then we convert it to the markdown or whatever we need for the landscape in a GitHub and continue with the PRs. You know, just to keep it more flexible in an initial state until we know how we want to make it look.
So circling back, what's the best action forward on this section here? Do we remove it and move this all to a spreadsheet within our Google group? Or do
I
we?
think so. Yeah,
Okay.
replace it with a line and a link to a Google spreadsheet. And then a good idea for control might just be, hey, if you want to add your project to this list, you know, you can request access here. And that at least gives us, you know, some level of awareness of people that want to change it or add to it. And then it's a conversation starter for, hey, I represent this project. I think it should be added for this reason. And yeah, I'd be happy to come talk to your group next month, something like that.
Great. And I think also that could be a good opener for every bi-monthly meeting is looking at the spreadsheet, going into Google and seeing the delta in the past 2 weeks and seeing what projects were added, and then saying, oh, cool, announcement, there's these 2 new projects. Quickly go to the link and just spend 5 minutes on them. Could be kind of fun.
Yeah. And in terms of how many projects we expect, I mean, I think this list is a good first swag, and this is maybe half the universe. We may get, you know, another dozen or so projects wanting to sign up for this and be involved over the coming months. And I think that would be a good number. You know, as long as it's really the participation and the contribution part that's going to, I think, weed out others that just want their project added with nothing else behind it. And if that's the case, then we feel like maybe their project isn't well positioned for this exercise. You know, we have to have some level of engagement with them. But if they can request that through requesting access to the sheet, it's a first level of filter to make sure that they're adequately, I think, representing their community and wanting to contribute.
That sounds good. Is anyone opposed to the spreadsheet movement?
Can we invite the speakers instead of just waiting for the contribution? Does it make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's always good, right? Even without the landscape, just inviting people to join and present. That's
Yeah, I think
That's great.
one flow could be we could even have a member of the working group who's like, this is a working group responsibility. But when you see a new project added, put up a GitHub issue on their GitHub saying, would you be interested in talking about your project? That's something that brought me into this working group. I think Steve may have, or maybe it was I think maybe Runtime Tag did that, where they put up something on Ocri that was like, would you be interested in presenting in the Runtime working meeting? And that brought me into that community. So I think having someone who does that, sees the project, goes to the GitHub page, puts up a issue with a question tag and invites them to speak could be good.
Okay, just a reminder, I think we're at the time limit now. Any last minute things we want to get resolved before another meeting in a week?
So I think for one, just assigning tasks. So is anyone interested in setting up the spreadsheet?
If nobody speaks up, I guess I could do it.
If you create a spreadsheet and just put it here, Steve, I'm happy to help port. We can just delegate who's on what bullet.
Let me just do one right now.
Okay.
Yeah, keep me in the loop as well. I can help.
And then I'll leave that. Other thing is references. I guess we need to start like adding footnotes for when the references are relevant. Anyone interested in taking on linking references throughout the paper? So there's times when we reference these things, but don't have necessarily footnotes, so maybe having something where these are numbered references. I can do that.
Yeah, Kate, I can help with that. I think there might be a question of how do we want to reference that? But we don't have to discuss the how now, whether it be numbered or what have you. Because most of these also have a hyperlink where it's stated within the document already.
Yeah, and it doesn't need to be pretty because we're gonna move this to Markdown soon anyways. Okay, and then I think folks who don't have anything explicit to do but want to be involved, just going through and resolving adds and replaces where they seem acceptable, maybe pairing up with someone else if you don't feel comfortable making those decisions independently. That would be very helpful. One last thing, can we delete this clump here?
Yeah.
Or do we still have a to-do that we want to make sure that this data is all encompassed in the larger doc? I think we still have a to-do. Is anyone interested in taking on a to-do of going through this section and making sure we address these points, or if we don't, documenting that maybe in the working group meeting notes or somewhere else?
I'll go through it for sure. So
Okay.
I might not do everything. I mean, so as much as I can.
Okay, and then feel free to ping me or put in the working group if you want help with that.
Sure.
I think I'm going to, can I move this to a different section so we feel like we have something for reviewers to look at?
Yeah.
I'll move it up here. Or maybe this is the same as this. I don't know. Okay, and so then I think we can put a call to action in the working group Slack for people to start reviewing this document. And adding comments, if that seems good. Okay, well, we're certainly over. So I think that can conclude our meeting.
Okay, thanks, everybody, and we'll see you for another meeting in a week.
Awesome. And Amar, I'll send you an email